Hello, and thank you for joining me for another exciting lesson from the Garden for Health series, supported by the UT Health School of Public Health, Nourish, and the Garden Club of Houston. Today we will explore the topic of plant propagation, or as I like to think about it, making plant babies. We're starting today's chat with a horticulture-inspired musing from Dr. Hope Jarin, an accomplished geobiologist and writer. I think plants present an opportunity for people to look closely at something and get interested in something that's truly very much outside of themselves. I really like this quote. I think it reflects how our modern lives are overwhelmed with demands on our time and attention. Many of us internalize this daily stress and it weathers us like the limestone beneath a waterfall. Across the world, COVID-19 has disrupted our individual routines and even our societal norms. Now more than ever, spending time outdoors offers some respite from this chaos, a temporary eddy where we can enjoy an instinctive wonder and fascination of the rhythms of the natural world. For the next 20 minutes, clear your mind and spend some quality time with us in the Nourish Garden and Kitchen. In today's lesson, I'll talk briefly about propagation, methods of starting new plants, and how to use your new plants in the garden. After the propagation overview, we will head out to the garden, virtually at least, for a look at what's growing, and I'll demonstrate how to start new plants for you. During this lesson, treat this as a presentation by advancing the slide continuously until you've covered all of the material. During the garden activity and cooking demonstration, you will work alongside me and play at your own speed at home. Now let's start with propagation. What is it? As I mentioned earlier, propagation is a means of making plant babies, usually a lot of them. Gardeners and farmers want to create more plants because that means we continue our food source, or we are able to produce more of those plants for planting or for seed source. Propagation normally occurs naturally without human intervention and artificially, you guessed it, with human help. Natural propagation can occur anytime the wind blows pollen from one flower to another, and artificial propagation occurs when handsy humans intentionally pollinate, sow seeds, create root cuttings, or graft one part of a plant onto another. I want to start with a little bit of a throwback to biology. So one of the most common ways that we think of starting new plants is through seeds. And creating seeds requires that the plants get some help from the birds and bees. When a hummingbird flirts with a flower, they actually help the plant reproduce sexually by depositing pollen from the male part, the stamen, of one plant to the female part, the pistil, of another plant. The pollen travels down to the ovary where it fertilizes the plant ovum, and then what we observe as a fruit, vegetable, or berry are actually clever seed packets. These colorful and tasty packaging co-evolved to entice hungry animals like ourselves to take a bite and distribute the seeds in the surrounding fertile ground. In contrast, cuttings is a form of asexual propagation and does not require help from another pollinator or contribution from another plant. The asexual reproduction is actually an incredible ability of a plant to regrow its tissue into a complete plant with the identical characteristics. So, for instance, a leaf cutting will produce stems and bulbs, whereas the bulb or the root cutting will produce stems and leaves. Now, finally, another form of creating more plants is grafting. And grafting takes a young or a new leaf or stem bud and embeds it within another more established plant, usually the root systems or a branch. This creates a plant with two or more sets of characteristics. And gardeners or farmers can use this to their advantage by growing a plant that they love that may not do well in a certain climate or condition. For instance, using the roots of a plant that is well adapted, say, to really hot and dry conditions, and then grafting on a fruiting branch that normally prefers cool and damp conditions. We see this a lot with apple trees and citrus trees. It allows for gardeners to take the roots as a base, and roots that might be really well adapted to high water or humid environments like Houston, but then they're able to get fruits that have qualities that we might normally see growing in a cooler climate. Now we get to talk about seed germination, or the process in which the inert seed grows into a spunky little sprout. So the seed starts as the dormant or sleepy progeny resulting from a pollination event. So there is considerable energy and nutrients, especially potassium and phosphorus, that contribute to making those seeds. Each seed, big or small, is a new plant starter kit essentially, containing a plant embryo and all the necessary nutrients. A plant embryo consists of a radicle, which will become the roots, a protein-rich cotyledon, which are essentially the primordial veins and leaves of the baby plant, and a carbohydrate-rich food supply called the endosperm that the baby plant will use to emerge from the protective seed coat and then push through the layer of soil towards the sun. Now, there are 4 important considerations when planting our seeds. One is thinking about the site in which we plant our seeds. Ideally, we want a place that has adequate sunlight, and that can really vary for the plant. Some plants need direct sunlight, which is anywhere from 6 to 8 hours of intense sunlight, the type of sunlight that casts a strong, stark shadow. Other seeds or plants might prefer or do well in partial shade or kind of dappled light, and that's usually only a couple of hours of direct sunlight and then reflected light. Either way, we need some good sunlight for our seeds to start thriving once they start emerging from the ground. Another consideration is preparing the soil for our seeds. So our newly awakening or germinating seeds are waking up from their dormancy and emerging from the seed coat. And they need plenty of moisture and space to start growing their delicate roots and delicate stems. And because they don't have very strong root systems for gathering water or nutrients for those first few weeks, we really need to help make sure that those nutrients are readily available to them around in the soil. So an ideal soil mixture for seeds would actually be very nutrient rich, hold on to water, but not too much, so allow for some drainage, and also have kind of a loose, fine texture so that the new roots can kind of comfortably grow into the medium. And so we want to look for a growing medium that is mostly composed of sphagnum moss or coco coir. Both are fluffy materials that retain water and allow for air circulation. Now, some seed mixes might contain something like peat or peat moss, and that's been popular for decades, but it's recently fallen out of favor because it's a less renewable resource. It is a good option if that's the only thing that's available to you, but if I could recommend a medium, I would choose one that uses sustainable sourcing of sphagnum moss or coco coir. Another element that's going to be in that mixture is crushed perlite or vermiculite, and that's added to our growing medium to help excess water drain. And you'll notice it because it's the little white balls that appear on the top of the growing medium after several waterings. And another important consideration for planting your seeds is checking a sowing date chart as we see in the slide. It gives us a good idea of the seasonality of that seed, or the best season, aka the best growing environments, which is going to be the temperature and the sunlight for that seed to thrive. And I would also recommend that you plant your seeds at a depth of about 4 to 6 times the seed's height. You can check seed packets for the measured recommendations, but an example of that is if you have a 1 millimeter seed, you want to plant it approximately 1/4 of an inch into the soil. You want to plant it just enough below the soil surface so that it's nestled into that medium, but it doesn't really have to struggle to grow through the medium and then reach sunlight. The final consideration when planting our seeds is to make sure that our space is really well watered. We really want to irrigate well when we first plant and check the moisture levels daily until it's established. Now let's do a little bit of troubleshooting. Have you ever bought a packet of seeds, carefully planted, nurtured them for weeks, but then no promising green sprout ever appeared? You might have dismissed it as, the seeds being duds, or chalk it up to having a black thumb. But wait, after leaving their parents, aka the plant, via wind or animal digestion or dropping, seeds reserve their energy in a dormant state while waiting for the right environmental conditions to emerge. Seeds can sense environmental cues like hot, cold, temperature, and moisture level. It's vital to their survival that they do so. So seeds have developed a thick seed coat, which is actually a really handy protective measure to protect them against protect the vulnerable plant embryo from damage. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can overcome any type of failed germination that might be occurring because the seed is not sensing that the right environmental cues for coming out of dormancy and germinating. So we can do that in a couple of ways. We can use a technique called scarification, which is really helpful with large seeds or seeds with thick seed coats, like nasturtiums or moonflowers. And you can use a nail file or some sandpaper and just gently rough up the outside of that seed. You don't need to wear the seed down, and that will actually damage the seed, so just gently rub the outside a couple of times to create little micro cracks. Now, just a little pro tip here. Some seeds, aka beans, that look really big and tough they actually have really thin seed coats. So for beans like black beans, adzuki beans, chickpeas, you don't really need to worry about roughing those exteriors up. They look big, but they actually have thin seed coats, so you can just give them a good soak if you want. Now, other seeds benefit from giving them a nice soak or chilling. Some flowering perennials like lavender or butterfly bush will do well if you stratify them or pre-chill those seeds by removing them from their packaging, evenly placing them on a damp but not sopping wet paper towel, rolling up that paper towel and then placing it in a Ziploc bag, and then place in a refrigerator for 1 week or up to 8 weeks before planting. What we're doing here is kind of mimicking the natural conditions that these seeds might experience. Because, for instance, lavender, normally it seeds in the fall. The seeds lay dormant on the soil or just under the soil surface during the winter, and then start to emerge in the spring. So we're just kind of mimicking those environmental conditions and signals for them. Now, there are some seeds that do well with a nice warm soak. That would be large seeds like corn, squash, beets, lima beans, sunflowers, watermelon, and cantaloupe. And really what you want to do is kind of like what's seen in the image on this slide, is you have a jar of warm water and you put those seeds into the warm water and let them soak in a sunny spot for, a few hours to a day before you plant them. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here with our seeds and troubleshooting them is you want to make sure that you have, again, the right soil mixture. Sometimes seeds don't do well because they don't have the right nutrients, or very often is they dry out. So I do, again, recommend using a seed starting mix because it helps retain water, and that water is essential, especially for just germinating seeds. Now let's talk a little bit about planting our seeds. There's two different techniques. Direct planting is when we put seeds directly into the soil as pictured on this slide. Advantages of this technique is that it takes less time and fuss over starting new plants. And it's pretty simple once you've prepared your soil or bed to place the seeds evenly in that bed or container. Disadvantages are that some of the new seedlings might be pretty wimpy and require a little bit of care and attention to weather conditions to make sure they don't get baked in the sun or dry up. Even a short time without adequate water or too intense of sunlight can cause them to wither. I know this all too well, and I'm sure a few of you have experienced this too, especially living in Texas. Now, the second technique is indirect planting, and that's when we start the seeds in a protected environment, like the inside of your home or in a greenhouse. And this really allows the seed to grow into a seedling that can later be transplanted when it's a young plant. If you've ever been to a plant nursery or garden center, this is their specialty. You know it's spring in Texas when you see the young tomato and summer squash plants popping up on racks outside of grocery stores. These young plants can then be removed from their initial growing container and then planted into a prepared bed or container garden where it'll remain for the rest of the growing season. Now, the advantage of direct planting with transplants is that it feels like more of a sure thing that the plants are going to grow. The plant has had some time to grow roots, to soak up some water, and grow some foliage that allows it to take in lots of sunlight. Cons of this method is, as you might imagine, it can be a little bit more costly to purchase these transplants. So instead of spending $1 or $2 on a packet of seeds that contain hundreds of seeds, you might be spending $3 to $5 per plant. So that's why I do recommend learning or experimenting with starting your own transplants, because you can save yourself a lot of money by creating your own transplants. And if you feel like you kind of have some trouble establishing from seed, this is a great option because you can start your transplants inside, and then when the weather becomes a little bit more amenable to the plants, you can put it outside in the ground or in the containers. Now, this is where I want to offer you some really great tips on starting your own transplants at home. So if you are interested in doing your own transplants, stay tuned to this. And I wanted to show you how you can do this using a few common items around your home. And this is really a good alternative to purchasing those expensive seed starter trays that you might see in a store. And the benefit too is you're repurposing things that you might normally throw away or discard. So the first one I want to show you is upcycling these paper towel tubes and toilet paper tubes. We so often throw these away, but you can cut those paper towel tubes into half or thirds. You really just need like an inch or two of tube. And you put the soil in and then put a couple of seeds per tube. I really like how in this photo it shows them stacked neatly in a Tupperware container. I think that's a great idea because you can add some water to that container, and then the soil and probably the container too will wick up the water up to the seed. And then to transplant, it's just easy. You just pop it out of the container, you even peel the container away. Now, the second one we see on the slide is on the far right top corner, and what you're seeing is a potato that's cut in half, and it looks like a little bit of it is scooped out. I haven't tried this technique myself, but I've heard of other people doing this, and they've had a lot of success with it. And likely it's because potatoes contain a good amount of potassium, and potassium really helps to boost germination. So I think this is a great technique, and I bet you could even just plant the entire plant, including the potato, into the ground once it starts to grow maybe an inch or two in height. The third technique I want to show you is in the bottom left corner, and you'll see eggshells, and from the eggshells are growing little seedlings. I really like this technique because, again, you're recycling products that you're using at home, and instead of throwing them away, or maybe you've thrown enough eggshells into your compost, this is another way to recycle those eggshells. I would recommend for this technique, though, that you do wash the eggshells out with soap and water, because you don't want any type of bacteria like E. coli or Salmonella to contaminate the soil. So do give these eggshells a rinse, but I love the idea of putting the soil in the eggshell, putting a few seeds. I would recommend not putting as many seeds as is pictured in this slide. Maybe just put in like 4 to 10 seeds per egg shell, and then make sure that you give it plenty of water. And then finally, in the center, the bottom center of the slide, we see the recycled egg cartons. So maybe you don't feel comfortable using the eggshells, totally understandable. Use the recycled egg cartons, preferably the cardboard type, and you can either keep the cups all in a row as it normally comes, or as in the picture, you could separate them. And I think this is a great option. It's basically like a low-cost option for plant growing containers. So I think this is fabulous, and you can just plant this into the soil once you get your seeds established. Next, we get to talk about root cuttings. I really love working with root cuttings. This is maybe one that I use most often when I'm creating my own transplants, because it's so easy. And as you can remember, seeds, that's sexual reproduction for the plant, so it's different characteristics. Well, now we have asexual propagation or reproduction, and it's that ability of the plant to regrow different parts of the plant from that original piece of tissue. So here we have the root, and it's able to grow the stems and the leaves, as we see with these sweet potatoes. So root cuttings work really well for sweet potatoes, carrot tops, onions and garlic, ginger, and carrots. And you can see all of these pictured. If you've ever held a potato in your fridge or on the counter for long enough, you've probably seen it start to sprout a stem and leaves. So you know how easy this is. And how you get these plants to root most effectively is you take that root or the end of the plant, like for example, we have the ends of some romaine lettuce on the top right corner, and they place them in small shallow mason jars. They fill those jars to about 1/2 full of water. They place the root side down into the water, and then they place it in front of a light source. And that light source is pretty important because it encourages the plant to grow the stem and leaf further. And then my recommendation is to make sure that there's plenty of water and to refresh that water every couple of days, because you don't want it to become murky and it'll start to smell bad too. And once you start getting, a few roots, you can see pictured very clearly with a sweet potato here. You can kind of see it in the bottom right corner with these green onions. Once you get some good root growth, you can go ahead and transplant that into the soil. Now let's talk about starting from herbaceous cuttings. This works really well for a lot of herbs such as basil, lemon verbena, oregano, rosemary, stevia, tarragon, thyme, and even works sometime with tomatoes. This works really easily. You just pinch or cut off a stem that has several leaves, nice healthy leaves, and then you place it in a glass of water. And similar to how we propagated those root cuttings, you do want to make sure that you're refreshing the water every day or two, just to make sure that there's no bacterial overgrowth. And really, you wait until you get maybe 1 inch of root growth, and then you're able to transplant that into the soil. Finally, we're going to talk about stem cuttings and propagating woody stems. This can be a little bit more challenging. It works really well for blackberry, canes, blueberries, figs, grapes, and rose. If you've ever tried to do this on your own, you know that it's not quite as easy as starting or propagating from just like a semi or herbaceous stem. What I would recommend and what I find most successful is if you cut 4 to 6 inches of stem, and it can be just the terminal end of the stem, and you can have it so that there's either leaf buds, as you can kind of see here, these small green buds that are emerging from the stem, or it might have a couple of leaves. And I always strip the leaves off. If there's a lot of leaves on the stem, I always strip it off so that at least there's 2 inches of bare stem. And then what I do to really make sure that it starts to root is I'll dip one of the ends into a rooting hormone, which you can purchase at a garden supply store. And then you place that stem in soil, a potting soil mix like we've talked about before. And then you really want to make sure that you adequately water that mix until those roots are established, and that can take about 1 to 3 months. So you'll want to be patient with this, but it's really rewarding because you're able to sprout so many wonderful plants. Like one of my favorites is fig and blackberry. So I've tried this several times and it's worked. The last technique I want to talk about quickly is a technique called ground layering. This is one that I don't see used too often, but I think is really highly successful for plants that kind of have creeping vines. For instance, strawberries, blackberries, roses, pumpkin, and mint. And what you do for this is, as you can see in the picture, we have a woody extension of the plant, and that plant, it's kind of naturally growing out long and leggy. And what you want to do is kind of dig a little bit down into the dirt, maybe 1 or 2 inches into the soil, and then you push that that leg into the soil. And then because that bit of the stem, or that leggy stem, has contact with the soil, which contains nutrients and water, it's encouraging the stem to actually start to grow some roots outgrowth. And then I like to kind of weigh it down. In the picture you see a little metal wire kind of keeping it against the dirt, but you can also use a rock. Sometimes that's what I'll do. I'll kind of put a small pebble that weights it down, and then I'll rebury it with the dirt, and then I'll just wait a couple of months, and then usually the roots will grow. And what I like to do is I kind of leave it. It just helps support the overall plant. Or if you want to create a separate plant entirely, you can cut this stem off from the mother plant, as we call it. So I know we've covered a lot of material here, so I wanted to give a brief overview of the most important points of the program so you can be successful. And then we'll practice this in our garden activity. And so in starting seeds and in starting young plants, you want to make sure that you have a good quality soil. You want to have a spongy sphagnum or coco coir, and one that has perlite or vermiculite, which really helps encourage adequate drainage as well as moisture retention. And speaking of moisture, tip number 2 is we want to make sure that our soil is damp, but we never allow it to dry out. So I recommend checking your soil on a daily basis. 3, you want to make sure that your seeds or your transplants receive strong direct sunlight or light at least 6 to 8 hours a day. 4, temperature-wise, we want to make sure that our seeds and our young plants are comfortable. We want to avoid extreme temperatures like extreme heat and freezing conditions. So that's why it's really nice if you can start our seedlings or our young plants inside, because then we're able to control that environment. Finally, use some of the tools and resources that we have out there. One of them for starting plants is a rooting hormone, which we can use on the end of stems to encourage faster root growth. Now we get to practice what we've learned in today's lesson. We're going to head to the holistic garden where I'm going to show you how to start your own seeds, and those sprouts and microgreens that we start growing, not only can we use them in starting our own plants for our garden, but we can also use them in our culinary creations. And then we're going to head over to the kitchen, our teaching kitchen, where I'm going to show you how to use those new seedlings in the form of sprouts to make a delicious dish, one of my favorites, marinated tofu and sprouts. Use the step-by-step guide along with the video recording of me demonstrating how to create your own sprouts. Use the step-by-step guide to growing your own microgreens. Follow along during the garden demonstration where I show you how to make your own microgreens. And you can use this as a reference anytime you're inclined to make your own. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode in the Garden for Health series. I had a blast talking to you about how to start your own seeds and new plants. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. My information is on the slide here. And if you start your own sprouts, microgreens, or plant your own seeds, please show me pictures. I would love to know how it's going. And if you try the marinated tofu and sprouts dish, tell me what you think. I love to get feedback. Until next time, keep growing.